Good morning. I wanted to start with a special prayer this morning, and until just this morning, I was going to start with the famous prayer that's attributed to Saint Francis of Assisi. Can you not hear me? I'm sorry. I'll get closer. I was going to start with that prayer. I wasn't sure I knew exactly every word, and so I went online to type it out so I'd have something to read. And I changed my mind. I went to a copy of the prayer, which appeared in a publication this week from the chaplain's office at Yale University, which published a number of different prayers, including this one, which really struck me this morning, given where we are in this world today. It's called An Unending Love, the prayer, and it's written by Rabbi Shapiro, who is the Hebrew chaplain at Yale University currently. We are loved by an unending love. We are embraced by arms that find us even when we are hidden from ourselves. We are touched by fingers that soothe us even when we are too proud for soothing. We are counseled by voices that guide us, even when we are too embittered to hear. We are loved by unending love. We are supported by hands that uplift us, even in the midst of a fall. We are urged on by eyes that meet us, even when we are too weak for that meeting. We're loved by an unending love, embraced, touched, soothed, and counseled. Ours are the arms, the fingers, the voices. Ours are the hands, the eyes, the smiles. We will have your peace with justice, as we know that your peace will come from our hands, our eyes, and our love of one another. Today is the last class in this series on Judaism and Christianity in the first century. Incidentally, we ran out of the syllabus last week, and Nicholas placed a few additional ones on the stand behind you, and I think there may be one or two still there. And I have one more here, should any of you not have one, not have received one. It's the same syllabus for all four classes, so if you took one, you've got them all. Just again, a quick review of where we are. During the first century, when both modern Judaism and Christianity were born, the world was in turmoil, or at least in the Eastern Mediterranean, where those religions were formed. The Roman Empire, the Pax Romana, was present throughout most of the Mediterranean, but it seemed to be mostly absent in the area where Christ walked on the earth in the first century. But by the 70s, both modern Judaism and modern Christianity were moving forward. And as we noted before, it wasn't one Christianity, nor was it one Judaism. We know, of course, of Jesus through the Gospels. And one of the things that we often forget when we hear the Gospels spoken to us in a pericope or so each Sunday, that the Gospels were more or less written historically, in that Mark's came first, then Matthew and Luke, and finally John. And if we look at the words of Jesus, particularly the words of Jesus as they deal with his growing church and its relationship with Judaism, we can discover by placing those gospels in historical sequence, that the authors of those gospels were in fact reflecting new attitudes that the followers of Jesus were having toward Jews over the course of 50 or 60 years during the production of those gospels. And it's important for us to remember that as we go forward, because the harshest words about Judaism appear in John's gospel, the last gospel written, when conditions between the followers of Jesus and Judaism were at their worst in the first century. And so we need to focus on what we have in common. Of course, monotheism. We have the same God. We have more or less the same basic moral code. Jesus rebelled against formalism, and so did most of modern Judaism, although there was a reactionary movement later in both Christianity and Judaism, which seemed to repudiate some of that movement away from the formalistic period that Jesus seemed to be so uncomfortable with. And of course, Jesus was crucified. A horrific death, a total embarrassment, as Paul tells us, to Christians. The founder of our religion was executed as a rebellious criminal at the very beginning. And thus, it is incredibly miraculous that what has happened to us since then has indeed happened. We know that Paul, a contemporary of Jesus, quite by accident, began to admit a significant number of Gentiles to Christianity, and that act totally changed the course of our religion over time. By the end of the first century, the letters of Paul were being distributed around his churches. The synoptic gospels had all been written, probably had been copied, and again were being circulated among the churches. The oral stories that had been the centerpiece of the Christian meetings, liturgies, for the middle of the first century, were soon replaced with written accounts, and therefore began to solidify into common stories that all Christians could adopt and accept. And obviously, Paul's churches, particularly in Gentile lands, were thriving. By the end of the first century, it is generally assumed that Gentiles far exceeded Jews within Christianity. It's curious, however, that we have to lay alongside of that what was happening in Judaism at the same time. Of course, in late 68, a group of rebellious zealots from, we are told, the south, the desert south of Jerusalem, came into Jerusalem and occupied the temple. Many attempts were made by the Roman legions to remove them from the temple over the course of the next 18 months. And those attempts were largely unsuccessful. Some historians have suggested that they were unsuccessful because the zealots were being fed and assisted by the Jews of Jerusalem, who were not unhappy that the zealots had displaced the Roman-appointed high priest in the temple. Ultimately, a full Roman legion arrived in Jerusalem, headed by a nephew of the then emperor of Rome. And he thought he had instructions to take the temple under any circumstances. And of course he did. And in the course of taking the temple, he destroyed it. This, of course, set Judaism on its ears. Judaism had always been a religion which was centered on the temple, with pilgrim feasts and pilgrim visits to Jerusalem as many as 6 times a year for devout Jews. One could only sacrifice for the forgiveness of sin in the temple in Jerusalem. And I guess even then, there was a recognition that most of us are sinners most of the time. And therefore, if you wanted to reconcile with Yahweh, you went to Jerusalem to do sacrifice. And suddenly, after 70, there was no temple. Think about that. If you were a devout Jew, accustomed to reconciling with your God at least every year by making a pilgrimage to the temple and sacrificing, and suddenly you could no longer do that. Think of what that would mean. Just imagine, for example, if today every Christian church in the United States were eliminated. How would that change the way you practice your own religious life? Well, that's what happened to the Jews. They were lost. They didn't know what to do. And of course, there was no leadership at that time to lead them into an alternative to that sacrifice. Most historians now believe that the Romans were fearful that after the destruction of the temple, the Jews would become completely ungovernable, and that a key element in their supply chain from the south and the east would be destroyed, and that Rome would starve. They couldn't have that. And it is now believed that the Roman leaders in Israel at the time elected to go to a group of rabbis, and they charged the rabbis with attempting to bring the Jews back together. And they formally actually met in 76 in a coastal city near modern-day Tel Aviv, and adopted some additional principles for Judaism at the time, and began to emphasize almsgiving as a technique for the forgiveness of sin rather than sacrifice. Moving Judaism into its modern-day tripartite decision that one prays, one gives alms, and treats one's fellow human beings with respect. And this is the way a Jew relates to God. I think it's important to make us understand, for us to call to mind that when we think of our God, we also have 2 ways of approaching our God. We have individual prayer. We have the day-to-day moments, perhaps longer than moments, when we basically take the time and set aside the time to have a conversation with our God. And then there are other times, like this morning, when we gather in community and celebrate our God in community. And so we have these 2 ways of approaching our deity. Well, the first of those, the personal God, the God of personal prayer, dates right back to the Torah and Abraham. You will all remember, I am sure, the story of Abraham's conversations, even negotiations with Yahweh. Abraham set in motion for Judaism and also for Christianity the notion that we have a personal God, someone with whom we can have a personal relationship, a personal conversation, quiet time together. We can ask for things and hope to get them. We can praise, etc. But that God that we pray to in that context, is in fact the God of Abraham. And we share that God with the Jews. And it's important for us to remember that at all times. To some extent, our God of community, I will call him, also dates back to the notion of Judaism, because Judaism gave us the notion of the synagogue, the discussion of the holy book within a periodic liturgy, and the opportunity to take action in community. Judaism was very, very much a cultic religion where the community took responsibility for other members of the community. And in fact, I didn't do an exact scientific survey of this, but it seems to me that most of the hundreds of rules in the book of Leviticus that don't deal with personal hygiene, etc., deal with our responsibilities to each other. I'll give you a couple of quick examples. The cult of Judaism was responsible for orphans. And there was a regular procedure whereby orphans would be adopted by other members of the community. Similarly, when a man died, if he had a wife and a brother, it was his brother's responsibility to take his wife into the brother's family. And there are many more examples just like that. And so early Judaism, from thousands of years ago, has set up this notion that the community has responsibility for the welfare of its members. And of course, when we look at the Acts of the Apostles and the story that Luke tells us about the very early Christian church, we discover that the Christians very quickly adopted notions of ministers within the community who were responsible for the welfare of widows, orphans, the sick, and the poor. And in fact, that seems to be the origin of the very notion of deacon that we have in the Christian church today. The very earliest Christians, Christian deacons, were those assigned by the community with responsibility for the material welfare of the community, a notion that they shared with Judaism. So we see that by the end of the first century, Judaism had experienced enormous upheavals and was changing. It was the end of what is referred to as Second Temple Judaism and the beginning of what most historians today would refer to as modern Judaism. But as we all know, there were many forms of Judaism that came out of that period. There are parallels within the Christian church as well. We get a good feeling for those primarily from the letters of Paul. When Paul rails against people who come to his communities and attempt to lead them astray. And he talks about some of those who were preaching to his communities the formalistic notions of Judaism. And in fact, historians have even given that group of people a name. They're referred to as Judaizers. And that is people who would bring back formality and the formality of Judaism to the early Christian church. And Paul would have none of that. There were also individuals that Paul referred to as spiritists. These were people, you may remember in the letter to the Thessalonians, Paul advises against those people who were waiting for the second coming and had decided that since the second coming was imminent, they needed not to work, nor did they need to behave in any kind of a morally acceptable way because of two reasons. One, the second coming was coming instantly, and therefore there was no reason to like the squirrel, to collect nuts for the coming winter, because the coming winter wasn't going to come. There would be a second coming before then. And the moral strictures were there because Jesus preached, they said, that the body and the spirit were different. And the body was irrelevant. And if the body was irrelevant, why should we abide by any particular moral code? And so the Spiritists were those who were basically telling the people in Paul's communities that the Holy Spirit was the only important aspect of their lives, and they didn't need to worry about their bodies. They didn't need to work. They didn't need to adhere to any particular moral code. You can pretty much understand what kind of response that would appeal to in his communities. Once again, in his letters, Paul talks about the Spiritists. Although he does, in another sense, praise the Spiritists, because these are the people in his churches who spoke in tongues and who apparently were channeling the words of the Holy Spirit to his communities. I realize sometimes I get an echo and sometimes I don't. I guess when I'm not getting an echo, you're not hearing me well. Is that right? I apologize. There were others as well. By the end of the first century, there was a movement called Gnosticism. That's not the same word as agnostic that we use today. But the Gnostics believed a very, very elaborate structure of theology. They could not accept the fact that Jesus, as God, had been crucified, that no God could be crucified by man. And as a consequence, they adopted the notion that all of the life of Jesus was like an elaborate drama played out on the face of the earth, that Jesus controlled every minute of his life, including his apparent crucifixion and his rise from the dead. The Gnostics then went on to suggest that Jesus had left secret messages with certain people as to how we too could follow his way and be saved. That particular form of Christianity lasted well into the 4th century and was very, very strong. And in fact, that form of Christianity claims as its Bible the book of the Gospel of John, which is sometimes even referred to as the Gnostic Gospel, because so much of John's Gospel seems to suggest that Jesus was always in control of what was happening around him. By the end of the 1st century, we had set up a rivalry between Christianity and Judaism. As I mentioned to you in one of the early lectures, the Romans had a concept of ancient religion. And this was a very important concept because if you were a member, well, as I also mentioned at that time, the Romans were highly superstitious and pantheistic. And as a consequence, they often added to their pantheon the gods of the communities that they conquered as they developed the Roman Empire. And they allowed the people of the empire to continue to worship their regional gods, provided they demonstrated some sort of bona fides about that religion. And if that religion was ancient, had lasted for hundreds of years, perhaps thousands of years, and had a long history of adherence to it, it was designated as an ancient religion. And if you were a member of an ancient religion, you were freed from sacrifice to the Roman gods, save one, the emperor. And of course, you sacrificed to the emperor by paying taxes. And so that was a relatively easy thing to do. And in fact, we have a passage in the Gospels where Jesus is challenged about paying taxes to Caesar. And of course, underlying that notion is the fact that paying taxes to Caesar was deemed by the Jews to be an offering of sacrifice or tribute to the Roman emperor, and therefore was offering sacrifice to another god other than Yahweh. And so underlying that notion was a very deep one. I don't think most of us today consider paying taxes as anything like a sacrifice to a god, even if it is a sacrifice. But at any rate, by the end of the first century, the Christians were beginning to recognize that if they were going to survive within the Roman Empire, they needed to inherit or to claim the notion that they were an ancient religion. And they began to develop the ideas that Judaism was dead and that Christianity had supplanted Judaism as the religion of the one God. And those notions began at the end of the first century and were highly developed within the second century. They did that, the early Christian thinkers did that in a variety of ways. Most horribly, I believe, by creating the notion that the circumstances of the crucifixion of Jesus constituted deicide, that the Jews had killed God, or at least their God. A horrific concept, one incidentally that was not condemned by the officials of Christianity until the 19th century. And so for 1800, almost 1900 years, there were Christian prayers, not just in the Roman Catholic Church, but in all of Christianity, which essentially accused the Jews of killing Jesus and of deicide. And it took hundreds and hundreds of years to eradicate that notion, a notion that may even exist today. Of course, the footnote to that notion is that if the Jews had killed Jesus, then the Romans were guiltless. They hadn't done it. And by the end of the first century, of course, the Christians were beginning to recognize that they needed to curry favor with Rome if they were going to survive as a religion. And so moving the blame for the crucifixion from the Romans to solidly in the hands of the Jews helped to achieve that notion. Of course, modern theologians have rethought that quite significantly, and I don't have a good deal of time to talk about that this morning. I would have to give you just the bottom line, however, which is that most modern Christian theologians believe that the crucifixion happened because of all sin of humankind, and that the agents of the crucifixion happened to be a historical accident of a combination of Jewish fear and Roman fear of what would happen if the notions that Jesus was talking about became prevalent in the eastern part of the Roman Empire. There are a couple of other issues that have persisted to modern days. I don't have time. This could be a whole lecture in and of itself, but I find it quite interesting. Many of you, I'm sure, are aware of the fact that many ultra-fundamental Christian ministers are champions of modern Judaism, and actually particular champions of the war that's taking place before our eyes these very minutes. And the reason for that is very arcane, and that is there is a story in the book of Revelation that suggests that the second coming of Jesus, of God, will not occur until the temple is restored. And of course, the temple occupied the space which is now occupied by a major Muslim mosque on the Temple Mount. And therefore, the logic that these people are taking are that the Jews must prevail over Islam so that the Jews can tear down the mosque and build the third temple. And that by building the third temple, they will set in motion the coming of the kingdom. A very, very arcane notion, but it really suggests in many ways why we have some very, very strange bedfellows when we begin to talk about some of the politics of the Middle East. All of us, I'm sure, are familiar with most of the aspects, even the details of the Holocaust. The Holocaust was a major earthquake in the history of modern Judaism. It actually suggested to many, many Jews that there was no God, and that for 6,000 years, their worship of Yahweh was a fiction, because no God could have permitted the Holocaust to have happened. We still read so much rabbinical literature which is being published about the meaning of the Holocaust and its impact on modern Judaism. Of course, we played a role in the Holocaust as Christians. We have to acknowledge the fact that the National Socialist Party under Adolf Hitler villainized Judaism, was perhaps the culmination of hundreds and hundreds of years of anti-Semitic notions. And as a consequence, we do have to take some responsibility for the anti-Semitism which resulted in the ultimate destruction of a race of people in the Holocaust. We've come to, I think, an interesting point in the history of religion, first in Western Europe and then in the United States. Most theologians are now suggesting that Western Europe is running about a generation, maybe a generation and a half ahead of what's going on in the United States. And that, of course, is the growth of secular humanism and the rejection of all religion as the answer to anything. Concomitant with the notions of secular humanism, however, are the notions of tolerance and inclusiveness. And as a consequence, we hope that the notions of secular humanism will help us to achieve some better place when we deal with our Jewish and Muslim brothers and sisters in this world. Obviously, we have another incredible situation in the Middle East when we recognize that for close to 1900 years, the Jewish people were exiled from their land from about 115 to about 1948. There was no homeland for Judaism as such. I don't have the answers to what's going on in the Middle East right now. My preliminary and maybe final concept, however, is that terrorism and violence rarely solves anything. And we didn't see anything in the first century history of Judaism and Christianity growing up together in the Roman Empire, modern Judaism and Christianity growing up in the Roman Empire, which would change that notion. Fortunately, the Romans kept the cap on, so to speak, and prevented violence between the two religions as they grew up together. But we don't have that cap today, and I think we will continue to see some of the violence that we have seen. I don't have time this morning to really discuss in any detail the political situation there. All I can do is, as I did with my opening prayer, hope and pray that the violence done to innocents will be minimized, and that the voices of reason will once again begin to rule in that part of the world. I'm going to take questions at this point, or take comments if any of you have any. I have obviously not given you the full course in Judeo-Christianity, but I hope I've given you the idea that the growth of both of these religions in the first century was highly fluid and could have gone in many, many different ways. And that the actions of both sides contributed to the ultimate split. And therefore, I think it's important for us to focus on what we have in common and our common history. Thank you. Yes. We really don't know exactly what happened, okay? We do know, of course, that Paul's church, being a Greek Gentile church, placed much more emphasis and faith in the role of women in the life of his church. However, there remained a significant percentage of Christians, at first led by, we think, James, the brother of Jesus, and probably others. The Jerusalem community of Christians, which we believe moved to a town called Pella, P-E-L-L-A, around 65, 66. It's a town which is just south of the Sea of Galilee and on the Jordan side of the Jordan River. And there's a large Christian community there. We have a book in the Bible called the Letter to the Hebrews. For many, many years, that book was attributed to Paul and was included in the Pauline canon. And in fact, I have seen announcements in the last few years in Naples churches of discussions of Paul's letter to the Hebrews. Well, the general feeling today is that the letter to the Hebrews was not written by Paul, and it probably wasn't written until about 105, 115, maybe 30 or 40 years after the death of Paul. And now we are beginning to believe that the book of Hebrews represented the reassertion by the Jewish formalist members of the Christian community of their authority within the church. And that resulted, we think, in the rise of the patriarchal church, probably by the first quarter of the first century. And that by that time, there don't seem to be any concrete examples of women in roles of authority, although there are some pictographs in the catacombs suggesting that throughout this period, women were both deacons and presbyters or priests. But you may remember that throughout this period, well into the 2nd century, presbyters were not entitled to consecrate Eucharist. Eucharist was only consecrated by bishops, and bishops were the apostolic successors of the apostles. And as a consequence, the presbyters may have distributed communion, but they didn't consecrate it. So if they were women, it didn't matter. It didn't violate this notion of patriarchalism. But it does seem, in fact, many theologians today strongly suggest that a reassertion of Judaic culture into Christianity at the beginning of the 2nd century set the course for the role of women in the Christian church for many years. Yes. I'll be very, let me first of all state that I don't feel qualified to talk about Islam and the origins of Islam. I think it's important to note, however, that modern Judaism, post-Second Temple Judaism, and Christianity grew up in the same place at the same time. Whereas Islam occurred some 650 years later, when both Christianity and Judaism had moved very far along their theological arc. Obviously, Islam adopted large parts of the Hebrew Bible and even the Christian Bible, and reinterpreted many of the things that happened. And so in that sense, we still refer to Islam, Christianity, and Judaism as Abrahamic religions, in that we all claim Abraham as our ultimate ancestor. And we claim him as our ultimate ancestor in the sense that he is the first in recorded Western history to have established a relationship with one God. Yes. I'm sorry, I can't hear you. I wish I could answer the question as to why anti-Semitism is rising today. Certainly, I think we all have to recognize that there is a general atmosphere of violent tribalism in the United States, in fact, in most of the Western world right now, and that some of the leaders of our country see it in their best interests to enhance that violent tribalism. And I think the rest may just be the inevitable consequence of that. I'm not an expert on that. I'm studying that very issue, and I read a lot about it. But I think there's a growing consensus that a combination of fear, political advantage, and maybe even some economic deprivation have all together contributed to this new feeling. And it's sad. Yes. Well, obviously, I think the fact that we're all here suggests that we are personally not involved in that kind of activity. I think it's absolutely essential that when you hear someone make a comment that seems to be deliberately anti-Semitic, that you call it out for what it is, even if they are a close friend. And then I think it's also necessary for us to continue to learn as much as we can about what our Jewish brothers and sisters in this town are doing for the social welfare and well-being of Naples. I've suggested to Edward that we need to have a couple of sessions here where we invite one or more rabbis to come and talk to us. Not about anti-Semitism, but about the things that they are doing that we might do together. Thank you.